Michael Houston King writes, directs and stars as our town mayor in Lake Jesup, BONECRUSHER'S Revenge, also known as GATOR Lake. And this is a low-budget creature feature, well, you've probably guessed it, about killer alligators. Now, this is actually inspired by a true event, and apparently in Florida, where they were making these theme parks, they displaced a lot of gators, and they ended up in one particular lake, which was massively kind of overpopulated with gators. And in 2003, there was a rash of attacks by gators. So this movie kind of takes that premise and injects a little bit more of a fantastical element to it, where we have a kind of ginormous super gator who is the one really responsible for all of these attacks, nicknamed Bone Crusher. And he is the product of this kind of attraction, this gator attraction, kind of that has been feeding him body parts to try and get him this killer instinct, to try and get this kind of notoriety to attract tourists to this destination. Our protagonist is this ex-con who used to work with the owner of this gator attraction, who is hired to kill this bone crusher by the city mayor, because obviously it's getting too much. And what will happen? You'll have to watch the movie and find out. So let's discuss what works in this movie's favour. Now, I was unaware of obviously this kind of real life situation. I think the actual 2003 attacks in real life weren't actually any fatalities as far as I can tell. It was more just a lot of attacks. But there were obviously a variety of fatalities in the area over the kind of like those, you know, decades, due to the high amount of alligators in the area. So let's talk about it. What works in this movie's favour? I think it's a fairly decent setup for a kind of a B movie, based on a kind of a real event, but obviously extrapolated into the kind of the fantastical. But nonetheless, you know, we all know that there's gators in Florida and stuff, so why not have a kind of a movie that sort of, you know, takes that baton and runs with it, and to make a kind of, you know, a more kind of schlocky creature feature? Why not? I think our lead character is an interesting kind of protagonist. He looks like a kind of a guy who would normally be like the henchman of a bad guy and stuff. So, you know, he makes for an off-type style sort of action hero, certainly in this day and age. And he's kind of gives this sort of grizzled performance, so to speak, about this guy who's been inside for a long time and has this kind of like bad attitude, but he kind of wants to, he's been given a chance to help his family by killing this gator, so he's got a sort of, you know, a fairly sort of decent sort of motivation. And I will say, you know, I think the acting is all fine here. I think some of the characters are played with a kind of somewhat tongue-in-cheek, somewhat over-egged performance, but not to the degree where it's distracting. You know, we have our slimy owner of this sort of gator attraction, who is this sort of sleazeball sort of style character. But he's kind of played with aplomb, I would say, and I think everyone here does a fairly decent job when you consider this is obviously a sort of a low-budget B-movie. And this movie does have a fairly sort of interesting kind of setup in regards to, you know, what has happened. You know, why is this this attraction that had been feeding this particular gator these body parts to try and get it to be a killer and things like this? It makes for somewhat of an intriguing idea here. And obviously when you couple that with the real life situation with the alligators in Florida and the kind of how they were displaced and stuff in the 60s, you know, I think it makes for a kind of an interesting setup for a film. The movie also tries to incorporate more of a kind of melodramatic element in it, which I think are a double-edged sword. But obviously the upswing is it kind of gives some of our characters a little more depth in regards to their kind of motivations and what's kind of driving them in their relationships and things like this, and tries to, you know, give our characters a little bit more urgency and stakes through the film. So on a technical level, I think it was clearly a low budget movie. The The movie is fairly kind of well shot, I'll give it that. The VFX for the alligator is a mix between kind of stock footage and a kind of practical effects, practical sort of gator effects. And they wisely don't show it on screen for very long. So it's only ever on screen, our main sort of bone crusher alligator, in short kind of sequences, so we can't kind of look at it for too long and kind of judge it on regards to the clearly kind of low budget effect that it is. So I think that's probably a kind of a somewhat of a smart decision. But let's talk about what doesn't work in this movie. Okay, so let's just sort of expand on what I've just said. The actual alligator itself. Now, I presume people are watching this for a creature feature, for a killer alligator movie, but there is precious little killer alligator scenes in this film. We barely see our bone crusher in the title, and when we do see him, it's very fleeting, like I say. And the movie's runtime is more concerned with the kind of our main protagonist's plight, so to speak, to get a second chance for himself and his family, and his relationship with this kind of owner of this local business. That's the bulk of the runtime of this movie, and we get a couple of sort of alligator attacks through the movie. But it's mostly kind of splashing around in water. We kind of see a little bit of kind of the jaws in the water and things like this. But really not a lot. Not a lot of actual screen time for an actual alligator movie, if you ask me. Now, this is probably down to budgetary restraints, I would say. But as a viewer, all you care about is watching a creature feature. You're not too worried about the fact that they probably didn't have the budget to have a large, kind of practical, all-encompassing creature design here, but the end result is, I think you get precious little of a creature on screen, and as such, this runtime ends up being the stuff you're not as interested in, and it comes a little bit dull, and you feel like it's overstretched. I mean, even when we do see the alligator attacks, it sometimes looks like a little bit more of like a paper mache build, to be honest with you. I'm a little more forgiving with the effects, but I'd be behooved not to mention I don't think the effects here are particularly high tech, shall we say. But it does use practical effects over sort of CGI, but what we do get on screen, as I say, is fleeting and not particularly impressive, even when we do sort of see it. I think this setup is overly convoluted. We are told a lot of information, and I didn't really know why people were doing things. I mean, we're told that our business owner is feeding body parts, but it's never really clear why he's doing that. I mean, the assumption is that it sort of gains notoriety because we have this killer alligator, but no one is supposed to know that he's sort of doing this. Would a alligator really be able to tell the difference between? I mean, he's not feeding live people; he's feeding like body parts from like the morgue and stuff. Does the alligator have a really delicate palate where it can tell what meat it's being served and things like this? It doesn't really kind of make any sense to me and seems overly convoluted. The whole backstory with our kind of ex-con about his relationship with this guy, again, it's just kind of like lots of dialogue that's sort of told to you, and it's like, okay, well, maybe this would have been the thing to see rather than a kind of just a whole bunch of exposition through the film. And then we kind of get the idea that apparently this alligator is targeting people specifically to do with this alligator attraction, which again is just kind of said in a bunch of dialogue, and it's just, well, that seems rather silly. It's kind of like, Jaws 4 type of kind of silliness here, and it seems out of all the Jaws movies, that would be an odd one to be influenced by. I guess it's called BONECRUSHE'S Revenge, as in Jaws' Revenge, but it's like a little bit silly, and again, it's just delivered by a kind of some sort of dialogue here, and the links to how people are connected, shall we say, to this kind of this kind of gator attraction is very tenuous. For example, there is like a female reporter who's like from New York, and she's just reporting on this kind of gator attraction, and yet she's killed. And then there's like, well, she was reporting on this for quite a long time, so, you know, she kind of was connected. Well, how would the gator know that? So it's just a little bit kind of silly. And then we have the final confrontation with the bone crusher, you know, king-size gator, which is, you know, over 70 minutes into the movie, and it's over in a few seconds. And I was like, come on. I mean, we've had very little gator action in the entire film. And then our big finale is over in one fell swoop. It's very anticlimactic, I have to say. And the movie seems to think the audience is more interested in kind of like the personal melodrama between the characters and this kind of gator kind of situation, which I would probably say that's probably not the case, if I'm honest. So the finale is a little on the weak side, I have to say, which is again sort of disappointing. If it had saved, we see precious little of the creature, but we have a really kick-ass finale, fine, you know, maybe I can be a bit more forgiving with that. But we don't really get that, and the movie up until that point sadly becomes a little bit overstretched in areas where I feel like it didn't need to be. Like a lot of scenes with dialogue with our protagonist brooding, or our kind of you know, our attraction operator scheming, or the kind of the mayor played by our director being kind of like, you know, duplicitous and things like that. And it's like, great. But even the setup, I feel, is rushed through as well. So the movie doesn't really deliver on its finale. I think it doesn't really deliver on its setup. And then what we get is a lot of time spent on kind of melodrama in the kind of the bulk of the movie's runtime, with a couple of, like, you know, nobody character attacks for this gator peppered in. So it's not a strong movie. I don't think it's necessarily a bad film. I would say it's competently made, and I think what we have on screen isn't like, you know, the acting isn't horrible, the dialogue isn't too horrible. It's kind of gets a fairly sort of good balance with its sort of tone in regards to tongue-in-cheek versus kind of like a serious kind of film. But ultimately, I think it misses the more interesting elements of this film, and is ultimately a little dull, and then just doesn't deliver on the actual creature feature elements itself. So for me, it's a 4 out of 10. It's a below average film overall, but I don't think it's necessarily terrible. Have you seen it? What were your thoughts? Leave me a comment and I'll look forward to seeing you next time.